Silence is often mistaken for weakness, but in a room packed with arrogant billionaires, it was the ultimate trap. When a dismissive elite crowd completely ignored a silent tycoon, one struggling waitress dared to speak his language. What happened next destroyed careers and changed her life forever. Keep watching. Crystal chandeliers cast a golden, suffocating glow over the grand ballroom of the opulent Belmont Hotel. Hundreds of voices merged into a deafening roar of privilege, punctuated by the clinking of champagne flutes and the sharp fake laughter of high society. Clara Jenkins stood near the heavy velvet drapes, her aching feet hidden beneath the crisp, floor-length black skirt of her uniform. She adjusted the heavy silver tray, balanced on her left hand, her fingers numb from the chill of condensation forming on the crystal glasses. At 24, Clara was used to being invisible. To the venture capitalists, real estate moguls, and trust fund heirs swarming the room, she was merely part of the furniture, a temporary fixture meant to dispense alcohol and disappear. Every agonizing hour she spent smiling through the pain in her arches brought her $12 closer to her ultimate goal, paying off the crushing medical debt hanging over her younger sister Chloe. Chloe had lost her hearing after a severe childhood illness, and Clara had spent the last 10 years acting as her primary caretaker, her fierce protector, and her voice. The two sisters communicated entirely in American Sign Language, a beautiful silent dance of hands that Clara cherished more than anything in the world. But in this deafening room, silence was nowhere to be found. Across the sprawling ballroom, a stark contrast to the chaotic networking was taking place. Sitting perfectly still in a leather wingback chair near the far corner was Arthur Pendleton. At 72, Arthur was a legend in the financial sector, a self-made tycoon whose holding company controlled half the commercial real estate in the city. Yet despite his monumental wealth, he was famously reclusive. Tonight he wore a sharply tailored charcoal suit that commanded respect, but his demeanor was entirely closed off. His posture was rigid, his sharp blue eyes scanning the room with a mixture of profound intelligence and deep, unspoken exhaustion. What the arrogant crowd of social climbers failed to realize was that Arthur Pendleton was profoundly deaf. He relied heavily on his hearing aids, which were currently turned off. The overlapping echoes, the booming bass of the string quartet, and the sharp shrieks of wealthy socialites had created a wall of unbearable acoustic feedback in his devices. He had simply switched them off, plunging himself into a peaceful, absolute silence. He was supposed to have his trusted interpreter, a man named Thomas, by his side, but a massive pileup on the interstate had left Thomas stranded miles away. Now Arthur was alone, an island of quiet in a sea of overwhelming noise. It did not take long for the sharks to circle. Beatrice Carmichael, the event's notoriously snobbish organizer, was the first to approach him. Dripping in diamonds and reeking of an aggressively floral perfume, Beatrice stood over Arthur, her mouth moving at a rapid, frantic pace. Clara watched from a distance as Beatrice plastered on a grotesque, exaggerated smile, gesturing wildly toward the buffet. Arthur simply looked up at her, offering a polite, tight-lipped nod, unable to parse a single word she was saying in the dim, shadowed lighting that made lip-reading impossible. Frustrated by his lack of a verbal response, Beatrice visibly huffed, rolling her eyes as she spun on her expensive heels and stormed away, muttering to a colleague about the rude, senile old man in the corner. Then came Richard Lawson. Richard was the newly minted CEO of a disruptive tech startup, a man whose arrogance consistently outpaced his actual intelligence. Desperate for a massive injection of capital to keep his failing company afloat, Richard had cornered Arthur, seeing the isolated billionaire as easy prey. Clara edged closer, pretending to wipe down a cocktail table, her protective instincts flaring as she observed the aggressive tech bro. Richard leaned in uncomfortably close to Arthur, completely violating the older man's personal space. He held up a glossy prospectus, waving it frantically in Arthur's face. "Arthur Dick Lawson here," Richard bellowed, his voice booming over the string quartet, drawing irritated glances from nearby guests. "I'm telling you, this is the ground floor. You need to look at these margins." Arthur leaned back, his brow furrowing. He pointed a steady, weathered finger to his ear, shaking his head slightly to indicate he could not hear. It was a universal, polite gesture. Richard, entirely blinded by his own narcissism, misinterpreted the gesture completely. He assumed Arthur was playing hard to get, or worse, mocking him. "Don't give me that deaf-ear routine, old man," Richard barked, slamming his hand down on the armrest of Arthur's chair. "I know you can hear me. Everyone knows you're a ruthless player. Stop playing games and look at the damn numbers." Clara's heart pounded in her chest. She recognized the look in Arthur's eyes. It was the same look of isolated frustration she saw in Chloe's eyes when impatient store clerks refused to look at her directly, when the hearing world refused to slow down for just 1 second to accommodate someone else. The sheer indignity of it made Clara's blood boil. Arthur was not being stubborn. He was trapped in a sensory void, being verbally abused by a desperate, greedy fool. Richard grew increasingly agitated. He began speaking slower but louder, adopting the deeply insulting, exaggerated tone one might use with a dim-witted child. "I said, look at the paper." Richard shouted, his face turning a blotchy red, snapping his fingers mere inches from Arthur's nose. "Wake up, Pendleton. Are you losing your mind in your old age?" The guests nearby finally stopped talking. A hushed, awkward ripple spread through that corner of the room. Dozens of people, influential politicians, wealthy heirs, brilliant lawyers, stood by and watched. They whispered behind their champagne flutes, embarrassed by the spectacle, but entirely unwilling to intervene. They simply let the wealthy tycoon be humiliated, writing him off as a confused, deteriorating old man who had overstayed his welcome at the top of the food chain. Clara gripped her silver tray so tightly, her knuckles turned a stark, alarming white. She had a strict rule about keeping her head down. If she lost this job, she would lose the health insurance that paid for Chloe's specialized speech therapy. She could not afford to make a scene. She could not afford to anger a high-profile guest like Richard Lawson. But as Richard reached out, actually daring to grab the sleeve of Arthur's bespoke jacket to force the older man to look at his documents, Clara's professional restraint instantly shattered. Clara moved before her conscious mind could stop her. She abandoned her silver tray on the nearest high-top table, the crystal glasses rattling loudly against the metal. The sharp noise caused a few heads to turn, including Richard's. Clara smoothed down her black apron, took a deep breath to steady her racing heart, and stepped directly into the tense, suffocating circle of space between the aggressive tech CEO and the silent billionaire. "Excuse me, sir," Clara said firmly, her voice cutting through the localized quiet. She looked directly at Richard Lawson, refusing to shrink under his furious, incredulous glare. "I need to clear this area. Please step back." Richard scoffed, his face contorting into a mask of pure aristocratic disgust. "Are you out of your mind, sweetheart? I am in the middle of a multi-million-dollar pitch. Go fetch some more pigs in a blanket and let the adults talk." He waved his hand dismissively at her, exactly as one would swat away an annoying gnat. Clara did not flinch. She deliberately stepped between Richard and Arthur, effectively shielding the older man with her own body. Then she turned her back completely on the sputtering CEO. She dropped to a crouch, ensuring her face was entirely level with Arthur's, bringing herself into the direct, clear line of his vision. The lighting here was poor, so she made sure the ambient glow from a nearby wall sconce illuminated her face. She offered Arthur a warm, genuine smile, the exact same smile she gave her sister when the world felt too heavy. Then she raised her hands. With elegant, fluid precision, Clara's fingers began to move. She didn't use the clumsy, halting gestures of someone who had taken a single online course. Her signs were flawless native and infused with deep respect. "Good evening, Sir." Clara signed her facial expressions perfectly, matching the polite, professional tone of her hands. "My name is Clara. I apologize for the terrible behavior of the man behind me. Can I help you move to a quieter room, or would you prefer I have him removed from your presence?" For a fraction of a second, Arthur Pendleton froze. His sharp blue eyes widened, darting from Clara's moving hands to her expressive face. The defensive, exhausted tension that had locked his shoulders rigid all evening suddenly melted away. A spark of profound relief and unexpected joy lit up his weathered features. He was no longer stranded. Arthur raised his own hands, his movements practiced and aristocratic. "You sign beautifully, Clara," he responded, a genuine warm smile breaking across his face. "You are the first person in this entire miserable building to treat me like a human being instead of a broken bank vault." My interpreter was delayed by the snow. "I understand completely." Clara signed back smoothly, her hands flowing like water. "My younger sister is deaf. I know how isolating these events can be, especially when the lighting is this terrible and the people are this arrogant. Do you need anything?" "Water, a private suite." The entire ballroom corner had descended into a stunned, absolute silence. The murmurs had died. Beatrice Carmichael stood frozen near the ice sculpture, her jaw practically on the floor. The socialites who had previously ignored Clara now stared at her in shock. The invisible waitress was effortlessly commanding the attention of the most powerful, unreachable man in the room, engaging in a private, graceful dialogue that completely excluded the elite crowd. Richard Lawson, however, was turning a dangerous shade of purple. Humiliation and rage boiled over. "What is this?" he demanded, his voice cracking loudly. "What are you doing? Are you mocking him? Stop flapping your hands around, you idiot waitress." Clara ignored him entirely, keeping her eyes locked respectfully on Arthur. Arthur's smile vanished. He peered over Clara's shoulder at the screaming tech CEO. The billionaire's hands moved again, this time with a sharp, authoritative quickness. "Tell the loud man behind you that I have read his prospectus. Tell him his profit margins are entirely fictional. His management style is completely erratic, and I wouldn't invest a single rusted dime in his pathetic company." Clara's eyes widened slightly at the sheer brutality of the message, but a tiny triumphant smirk tugged at the corner of her lips. She stood up slowly, turning to face Richard Lawson. The crowd leaned in, hanging on her every move. "Mr. Pendleton has a message for you, Mr. Lawson." Clara said, her voice projecting clearly across the silent crowd. "Oh, really?" Richard sneered, crossing his arms. "And what does the old man have to say?" "He says he has reviewed your prospectus," Clara translated, keeping her tone completely even and professional, refusing to break eye contact with the arrogant CEO. "He notes that your profit margins are entirely fictional, your management style is erratic, and he wouldn't invest a single rusted dime in your company." A collective gasp echoed through the ballroom. A prominent venture capitalist standing near the buffet burst into a short, uncontrollable bark of laughter before slapping a hand over his mouth. Richard's face drained of all color. The bravado evaporated, leaving behind a terrified, exposed fraud. "You're lying," he stammered, looking frantically around the room, realizing his reputation was currently bleeding out on the expensive carpet. "You're just a stupid waitress. You don't know what he's saying." Before Richard could launch another verbal assault, Arthur Pendleton did something that shocked the room even more than Clara's intervention. The Tycoon slowly pushed himself up from his chair. He reached into his pocket, retrieved his hearing aids, and deliberately placed them into his ears, turning the volume dials on. Arthur cleared his throat. When he spoke, his voice was thick and raspy, from disuse, carrying the distinct cadence of someone who had lost their hearing later in life, but it boomed with unmistakable terrifying authority. She translated perfectly Lawson. Arthur spoke every word, dripping with absolute disdain. "I am deaf, not dead. And I am certainly not stupid. I turned my devices off because this room is full of unbearable noise and empty people. But even in total silence, your incompetence was deafening." Richard took a panicked step back, shrinking under the Tycoon's blistering glare. Arthur turned away from the ruined CEO, completely dismissing him, and looked down at Clara. The harshness in his eyes vanished, replaced once again by profound gratitude and calculating respect. "Clara," Arthur said aloud, carefully enunciating her name, "you said you have a sister." Clara, still reeling from the shocking revelation that Arthur could speak, simply nodded. "Yes, sir." "Chloe." Arthur nodded thoughtfully. He reached inside his tailored jacket, pulling out a sleek, heavy black card, completely devoid of branding, save for a single gold phone number. He handed it to Clara. "Call my office tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock sharp," Arthur commanded gently. "I am firing my current public relations director. The man is an idiot who couldn't even arrange a proper backup interpreter for tonight. I need someone who understands communication. Someone who doesn't flinch. I think you'll find the salary more than adequate to cover whatever your sister needs." Morning sunlight pierced through the cracked, dusty blinds of Clara's cramped two-bedroom apartment, casting harsh shadows across the chipped-formica kitchen table. Sitting perfectly centered on the cheap plastic surface was the heavy, unbranded black card Arthur Pendleton had handed her the night before. Clara had barely slept. She had spent the entire night replaying the surreal events in the Belmont Hotel ballroom, half convinced she had hallucinated the entire exchange out of sheer exhaustion. But the card was real, its gold-embossed phone number catching the morning light. Across the small table, Chloe sat with a bowl of cereal, her observant brown eyes tracking every microscopic shift in her older sister's facial expressions. Chloe, 19 and fiercely intelligent, had lost her hearing to a brutal bout of meningitis at age 9. Since then, the world had constantly tried to place her in a box, a trend Clara had fought violently to prevent. "You are staring at that piece of paper like it is going to explode." Chloe signed her movements crisp and sarcastic, a half-smile playing on her lips. Clara let out a long, shaky breath and raised her hands. "It might explode my entire life, Chloe. The man who gave me this is Arthur Pendleton. He wants me to call his office for a job. A real job. Not serving overcooked shrimp to rich snobs." Chloe's eyes widened. She knew exactly who Arthur Pendleton was. Everyone did. "Call it," she signed, emphatically, nearly spilling her milk. "Call it right now. What are you waiting for?" "Permission." At exactly 8:59, Clara dialed the number. The phone did not even ring a full time before a crisp professional voice answered, expecting her. Within 10 minutes, a sleek black town car was idling outside their crumbling apartment complex. An hour later, Clara stepped onto the gleaming marble floors of Pendleton Holdings, a towering architectural marvel of glass and steel situated in the heart of the financial district. The sheer scale of the lobby was intimidating, designed specifically to make visitors feel small and insignificant. Clara, wearing her only well-fitted navy blazer and sensible slacks, refused to let the environment shrink her. As she approached the monolithic security desk, a deeply unpleasant, all-too-familiar voice sliced through the quiet hum of the lobby. Well, well, I suppose they really do let anyone into this building nowadays. Clara turned slowly. Standing near a bank of elevators, clutching a designer briefcase and looking spectacularly irritated, was Beatrice Carmichael. The event organizer from the night before was clearly doing damage control. Her firm had hosted the disastrous gala, and she was undoubtedly here to grovel to Arthur Pendleton to ensure he didn't pull his massive corporate accounts from her agency. Beatrice looked Clara up and down with sneering condescension, completely failing to recognize the waitress out of her uniform at first, before her eyes narrowed in realization. You, the catering girl who caused that spectacular scene last night. What are you doing here? Let me guess, the Belmont fired you for insubordination, and you came here to beg Mr. Pendleton for a handout. Clara maintained a neutral, completely unbothered expression. I am here for a scheduled meeting, Ms. Carmichael. Excuse me. Beatrice let out a sharp, ugly laugh. A meeting with whom? The janitorial staff. Listen to me, sweetheart. I have been waiting down here for 45 minutes to see Mr. Pendleton's chief of staff. Whatever delusional fantasy you have about the old man saving you is just that, a fantasy. He was probably just embarrassed by your little hand-flapping stunt. Before Clara could respond, a set of frosted glass doors swung open, and a sharp-dressed executive assistant marched straight past Beatrice, making a beeline for Clara. Miss Jenkins, the assistant asked warmly. Mr. Pendleton is ready for you in his private suite. Right this way. Beatrice's jaw dropped, her expensive foundation suddenly looking very chalky against her paling skin. Wait, excuse me. Beatrice sputtered, chasing after the assistant. I am Beatrice Carmichael. I represent Elite Events. I have been waiting nearly an hour. The assistant paused, offering Beatrice a chilling corporate smile. Mr. Pendleton cancelled his contract with Elite Events at 6 o'clock this morning, Ms. Carmichael. Security will escort you out. Please follow me, Miss Jenkins. Clara did not look back as she stepped into the private executive elevator. When the mahogany doors of Arthur's office opened, Clara stepped into a massive, sun-drenched room overlooking the city skyline. Arthur was seated behind a sprawling oak desk, reviewing a stack of physical documents. He looked up, a genuine smile, replacing his usual stern mask. Standing beside him was a professional ASL interpreter, a young man who immediately began signing Arthur's spoken words. Clara, please sit, Arthur said, his voice stronger today, resonating with authority. I trust the car was satisfactory. It was unnecessary, Mr. Pendleton, but thank you, Clara replied, taking a seat. She signed along as she spoke, a natural habit when in a room with another deaf individual. Arthur leaned forward, clasping his hands. Let me be entirely blunt, Clara. I am surrounded by coward sycophants and idiots. My previous PR director spent millions trying to hide my deafness from the board, treating it as a liability, a corporate secret. Last night proved that strategy is not only insulting but dangerous. It invites vultures like Richard Lawson to try and pick my bones clean. Arthur stood up, pacing slowly toward the floor-to-ceiling window. I do not want to hide anymore. I own 50 million square feet of commercial real estate. I want to overhaul it. All of it. Visual fire alarms, acoustic dampening for hearing aid users, partnerships with real institutions. I have already reached out to the Starkey Hearing Institute and Gallaudet University this morning to begin architectural consultations. But I need someone to lead this narrative. Someone who understands the reality of the deaf community, not a corporate shill. He turned back to Clara, his sharp blue eyes locking onto hers. I am offering you the position of Director of Accessibility and Public Affairs. Your starting salary will be $250,000 a year, with full premium healthcare coverage for you and your sister Chloe. We will have her evaluated at the Mayo Clinic by the end of the month." Clara felt the air vanish from her lungs. She gripped the armrests of her chair, her mind spinning violently. $12 an hour to $250,000. A life of scraping by, instantly erased by the stroke of a billionaire's pen. "I don't have a college degree, Mr. Pendleton," Clara said, her voice remarkably steady despite the hurricane in her chest. "I have no corporate experience." "You have a spine, Clara," Arthur countered instantly. "You stood down a screaming CEO to protect a man you thought was helpless. You cannot teach that kind of loyalty or courage in a business school. Do we have a deal?" Clara looked at the interpreter, then back to Arthur. She raised her hands, a fierce, unstoppable determination settling into her bones. "When do I start?" she signed. 6 months passed in a whirlwind of exhilarating work. Clara Jenkins completely transformed Pendleton Holdings. Gone was the secretive, isolated corporate culture that defined Arthur's later years. Under Clara's fierce direction, the company launched the most aggressive architectural accessibility initiative in the country. She ruthlessly audited building plans, fired contractors cutting corners on visual emergency systems, and overhauled the corporate hiring structure to recruit from the deaf community. Chloe was flourishing too. Specialists at the Mayo Clinic fine-tuned her care, and without crushing medical debt, Clara enrolled her sister in a prestigious university design program. The sisters were no longer surviving. They were thriving. However, the corporate world is deeply unforgiving. Richard Lawson had not forgotten his utter humiliation at the Belmont Hotel. In the 6 months since Clara publicly translated Arthur's devastating rejection, Richard's tech startup, Apex Dynamics, entered a lethal tailspin. Without Pendleton's endorsement, venture capitalists pulled out rapidly. Desperate, drowning in debt, and facing a mutiny from his own board of directors, Richard decided to launch a suicidal attack. If he was going down, he would take Arthur Pendleton's reputation with him. The battleground was set at the annual Global Innovation Summit. Arthur was scheduled to give the keynote address, his first major public speaking engagement since acknowledging his deafness. Clara spent weeks preparing, coordinating live captioning, ASL interpreters, and perfectly calibrated acoustics. Thousands of journalists and investors packed the auditorium. Arthur stood at the podium, speaking passionately about inclusive design. Clara watched from the wings, her eyes scanning the crowd. Halfway through the speech, chaos erupted. Richard Lawson, looking completely unhinged, shoved past an usher and stormed toward the stage. He held a thick manila folder, high shouting to bypass the microphone system. "It's a lie," Richard screamed, his voice echoing loudly. Cameras flashed wildly as journalists pivoted to capture the disruption. "Pendleton is incompetent. He's senile. This accessibility campaign is a smoke screen. He is medically unfit to run a holding company. I have the financial leaks right here." The room descended into an uproar. The massive live captioning screens frantically flashed his disjointed, alarming phrases. Arthur, feeling the violent vibrational shift, gripped the podium, his face darkening with anger. Security guards rushed the aisles, but Richard fought them off, desperate to reach the stage and legitimize his slander. Clara didn't panic. Anticipating a desperate maneuver, she tapped her earpiece. "Cut main floor acoustics. Boost the podium mic. Route stage cameras to my tablet." Stepping out from the wings, Clara walked calmly to the center of the stage. She tapped the microphone, the sharp, crystal-clear sound slicing through the auditorium's panic. "Mr. Lawson," Clara's voice boomed through the state-of-the-art system with cold authority. "Please stop fighting security. You are embarrassing yourself on a global broadcast." Richard froze, panting heavily, restrained by 2 guards, but clutching his folder. You're just his puppet. Tell them his company is bleeding. Capital. Pendleton Holdings reported a 22% increase in quarterly profits yesterday, Clara stated calmly. She pulled up a digital file on her tablet, casting it directly to the 50-foot screens behind Arthur. It was not Pendleton's financials. It was a formal, heavily redacted subpoena. Clara leaned into the microphone. Since you are eager to discuss financial leaks, Richard, perhaps you would like to explain to the journalists here why the Securities and Exchange Commission raided the Apex Dynamics headquarters at 6 o'clock this morning. The silence in the auditorium was instantaneous and absolute. Richard's face went bone white. The folder slipped from his trembling fingers, scattering fabricated papers. He had executed a smear campaign, entirely unaware that Clara and Arthur's new legal team had tipped off federal regulators about his fictional margins. The SEC is currently seizing your servers due to massive systemic investor fraud, Clara continued, devoid of pity. Your board of directors officially ousted you as CEO 20 minutes ago. You do not have a company to save anymore. Camera shutters erupted in a blinding frenzy. Reporters shouted questions, directing all inquiries toward the ruined man being dragged backward up the aisle. Richard did not say another word. He was escorted out, a broken shell of a man, his career completely incinerated, in front of the entire financial world. Clara turned to Arthur, offering a respectful nod. Arthur's chest swelled with immense pride. He stepped back up to the microphone, looking over the stunned crowd. As my Director of Public Affairs just brilliantly demonstrated, we value absolute clarity. Now let us return to the future of real estate. The auditorium erupted into a massive standing ovation. Clara stepped into the wings and checked her phone. Chloe had texted a picture of herself, signing "Champion" with 2 words, "Flawless Victory." Clara smiled. She had finally forced the world to listen. Sometimes the universe tests us by placing the most powerful opportunities disguised as moments of extreme inconvenience. Clara's courage to speak up when everyone else stayed silent not only saved a man's dignity, but completely transformed her destiny. If you were inspired by Clara's flawless victory over corporate arrogance, hit that like button. Right now, share this story to remind others the power of basic human respect, and don't forget to subscribe for more real-life karma stories.